Welcome. Today on the show, we're going to be diving into the evolving dynamics of virtual teams. Now, this was brought on by the shift of the way we work from the pandemic, but now it's become part of our daily lives, especially for many companies. We'll discuss strategies to handle burnout and also talk about the future of workplace arrangements, whether they're fully remote, fully in person, or some sort of hybrid mode. And joining me for this discussion is Dr. Jeff Kaplan. He's an executive leadership coach. Jeff, welcome.
Hi, Raj. Great to be here.
I'm excited about this topic because, boy, everybody's dealing with it. We're almost doing it right now as we record this podcast, working remotely. And so let's talk about what this means. So to get started, how about defining what we mean when we're talking about virtual teams right now?
Yeah, when I think of virtual teams, it's like any teams where folks are not in person, right? And so that could be audio, could be video, right? What the nuance here is that there have been virtual teams for a while, and there have been mixed teams for a while, which I know we're going to get into because that brings with it its own complication. But now post-pandemic, that it's almost like the default for many businesses and many people.
That's right, because the pandemic saw everybody working remotely, and then people were thinking this just proved that we can work remotely, but that's not 100% true for everybody because it does cause burnout, fatigue, just looking at Zoom all day long, missing out on water cooler conversations. There's a lot of things that affect company culture as you only go into a fully remote environment. So what kind of things do you see as leaders' top priorities? What are they reporting about having remote teams?
First of all, I want to say too, when you talked about looking at Zoom, it's also, we're not programmed as people to stare in a square.
Whoops, hold on, time out.
I,
I don't know
I,
what just
I know.
happened.
It was
Uh,
me. It was accidentally I didn't do any. I did this and the computer did that.
So I'm noticing that sometimes, like when I talk, sometimes I'll do a thumbs up and it will do a thumbs up bubble. I know it happens with yours too. By the way, I'm going to
Yes.
edit all this out of the recording.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a setting or something like
I'm
that,
sure
but
it is. You can turn off special effects.
okay. All right. Yeah. They shouldn't have turned that on by default. Anyway, let's get back to that. Let me re-ask
Yeah.
the question. How did I ask it? It was, okay. So Jeff, I'm going to say timeout, use that as my stamp for finding where I need to restart. So timeout, restart. What's the number one or the top set of issues that managers are reporting about having remote teams?
One is this idea of productivity, right? For an example, Microsoft did a study in 2022 and found that 85% of managers reported that they do not trust their remote workers to be working all the time, to be producing what they are supposed to be doing.
That's pretty serious. That's like a very significant number. And that was only just a couple of years ago
That's correct.
after the pandemic.
That is correct. And so it's huge. And what I say about that is that it's a little bit like what money does, right? So when you think of it, you've maybe heard the expression, money brings out the worst in people. What I say is money brings out the worst in people who want to be not good people, right?
Mm.
But if you're a good-hearted person that lives according to values and principles, money can bring more of that. And so when it comes to remote workers, if you have workers on your team that are trustworthy and take initiative and take ownership, things like that, the remote work is great. It gives them lots of flexibility. They feel supported and valued. Sometimes they overshoot because then they don't ever shut it off. But if you have workers who already are the kind of person that will steal the stapler if they can get away with it, then, and particularly if they have something going on at home that's distracting to them, then that becomes a problem.
How do you address this?
There was some research done that talked about 3 different types of distance with this idea, and think about this in terms of remoteness, right? So there's physical distance, right, which you can't really do much about, right? There's operational distance, which are things like different skill sets, different levels of engagement. But then there's affinity difference. And this is where you can have an impact. So the idea of affinity difference is that idea about relationships and trust. And do I feel a sense of affinity with each other? right? And so one of the things I would want people to take away is, as managers and others who have worked with remote teams, is ask yourself, what can I do to build affinity, just to sort of close that gap, right? So one of the things early on in the pandemic, when we started doing some of our trainings remotely, we did this one training that we used to always do in person, and suddenly we had to really look at some of our activities that we had to shift. And so we changed one of the activities to, and we gave everybody 10 minutes or maybe even less, and they were broken out into teams, and we gave them the first letter. Everybody had a first letter of the alphabet, so A through Z. And whatever your letter you were assigned, you had to run and find an object in your house and take a picture of that and then bring it back to the group and then share it with the group. So somebody might have taken a picture of their kid because their name was Sam and it started with an S, right? So that kind of activity is something that can help close that gap and actually leverage the fact that everybody is working, say, from home to create a sense of community.
And I think that sense of community is one of the most critical parts of being, at work. So you've got this way of doing it virtually as well as trying to do it remotely. What are some of the other pitfalls that managers are seeing, and what are you encountering as ways that they're mitigating these so that it doesn't have a negative impact on company culture?
One of the biggest is when you have mixed. I just
And by
me-
mixed, you mean some people are working remotely and some are in person.
Correct. Now
Mhm.
imagine too that you are starting at a new company and you are one of the remote folks. That's difficult.
That can be
A-
very isolating, very lonely.
It's really
Yeah.
hard to build trust, and it's really hard to be part of the conversation. Look, let's be honest, there's a real negative impact if you have a mixed group of between virtual and in person, and you're working remotely. And we're going to start seeing studies of looking at like succession and compensation, and we're going to start seeing a gap. So, one of the things that is helpful is having, whether it's quarterly, at least annually, but having retreats and other events where you're bringing folks in from wherever they are, right? But
Mhm.
then doing other things, Raj, that helps to celebrate the different sets of people, right? Making this up, but today's celebrating the remote folks day, right? And then you have all these little things that celebrate and honor the folks that aren't there much. The other thing, though, is making sure that you're creating an environment in your meetings where people really get to know each other. Like one of the things I like to do is check-ins, right? So everybody goes around and just does a, how are you feeling right now? And what data do you want to share about how you're feeling, right? Oh, we got a new puppy and we're excited about that. Or my son's wedding is next week and I'm really looking forward to that. So doing those types of things, again, to close that gap with affinity, that affinity gap, and just being really attentive to, if you have mixed teams, to make sure that you're really bringing in, quote, the outsiders.
This is different than if you had a fully remote team, because if everybody
Correct.
is remote, um, even though the people that have been with the company for a little while, they all know each other, and there may still be a bit of a learning curve and a leap for the new one to join, but everybody's remote at that point.
That's
What you're talking about is when there are people that are physically in the office and they hire somebody, because now that we can recruit from pretty much anywhere in the world, you're not limited to just qualified people in your local geographic area. You can hire them from everywhere, but you really have to foster that environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're a manager of people, here's my recommendation. If you can do this, all or nothing. If you're going to have remote workers and you consistently have meetings, then make everyone remote. And yes, do events on a somewhat, as much as it makes sense to do periodically, that brings everybody together. Even once, even in coaching engagements, like a lot of our coaching engagements are distance, right? Like they're in different states or different countries. And we will almost always start off or early in a coaching engagement, have one in-person meeting. And then to keep it, make economic sense, then we'll do the rest of the coaching sessions virtually. But oftentimes, Raj, that one in-person event can go a long way and have residual positive benefit if then the rest of your meetings are virtual.
I think these in-person events are priceless. I know that we used to do them even with our remote teams before the pandemic. And by remote, like we had an office in South Carolina where it might have had 10, 15 people in there. And then we had another office in Maryland, which had, 100 people. And so people knew each other. We talk all the time, but we never met. And so we tried to make sure that at least once a year we had an all hands, everybody's here. We go out for drinks, dinner, and we just have a good time, go bowling, whatever it is. All these things that create the bonding experiences that really tie people together.
Yeah, that's awesome, Raj. Here's the other thing, though, is make sure that you have very clearly defined expectations, metrics, timelines. If people are left to their own devices, even if they are people that take ownership and are really solid workers, they're going to flounder, right? And so you have to pay even more attention to the remote worker to be really clear with your expectations, metrics of success, timelines, that kind of thing. Obviously it's good anyway, but that's one of the things that you can do to really help make sure that people are productive working remotely.
Are you seeing, you'd mentioned that there was a study that managers suspected that people working remotely weren't as efficient as the ones that were in person. Aside from that, is there an actual performance difference aside from what managers might be thinking?
I see it, quite frankly, in our little world. There is, but what closes, and again, and it's not across the board. There are plenty of remote workers that are just highly productive and performing wonderfully, just like there can be in-person folks that are underperformers, right? The key, think of three different levers here. One is the people themselves, right? Make sure that you're hiring people that have autonomy, that take initiative, that take ownership and responsibility, right? That's key, right? So bringing in the right kind of person that has the right attitude and belief around work, right? Then the second thing is, as the manager, make sure that you're really being very clear and specific with your expectations and having these regular check-in touch points with the work and that type of thing. You don't micromanage, right? But just be really clear with what the expectations are. And then third is make sure that you're doing what you can to close the affinity gap. Bring people together, build community, do things where people get to know each other as people and not just as coworkers.
Let's shift now to talking about burnout. There is burnout happening
Yeah,
because
thousand
people are
percent.
working remotely. And how does that happen? And what can people do to make remote work less likely to cause burnout?
Yeah, burnout, and I think we're only now truly learning all the causes of burnout. So one is the obvious where people can't turn it off, and I'll come back to that. Another cause of burnout, though, as I may have mentioned earlier in the call, where we were not really to have to stare at a very narrow space for hours on end, nor look at ourselves constantly while we're talking. So there's all these
Mhm.
parts of the brain that are going in and in and in and out. And then just we're social beings, right? Now, yes, some people are more social than others, but as a species, we're social beings. And so we're removing that element. And now you add to it the idea of you get away from work and you go home, or you go home and you go to work, right? Whatever you have going on at home is slipping into your work world because it's right there outside the space that you're working from. So all that stuff contributes to burnout. The other thing I'll say, Raj, that I think is a major contributor to burnout is during the pandemic, we really quickly ramped up using all this technology to allow us to continue to work. And so we got much more productive, right? Because we weren't having go from meeting to another meeting down the hall at another building. We could stack things together. Unfortunately, we have that same now mindset of productivity, back to back meetings with no restroom breaks, no breathing breaks, no breaks to take notes. Even though now we're in this mixed hybrid world. And so we've ramped up productivity and we've not recalculated the expectation now that we're a lot of times in person. And the last thing I'll say is I think that we are still recovering from being in this global pandemic that killed and had other negative health benefits, outcomes to millions of folks. Many, we all probably know someone who certainly have gotten COVID and probably had passed away from COVID. And what that did to our psyche, I think we're just still adjusting. And the last thing I'll say is our kids are a great example of that. We already now know that their rate of anxiety is up. And this is also due to other things like social media and stuff, but their anxiety is up, the depression's up, and they've slipped behind in school because of the pandemic.
Yeah, speaking of the younger generation, I know that as newer members of the workforce come into the workforce, that having an in-person experience I've found is really important
Yes.
because they've never worked full time, 8, 9 hours a day for a full year. They might have had summer jobs or something. They might have had part-time jobs. It's a whole different ball of wax when you're doing it all day long. And it takes a bit of getting used to. And when you're doing that just on a computer screen all day long, that's a very isolating experience. And I think it can, in many cases, lead to people leaving the job because they're not getting that social connection that they might not think they need, but they really do need.
Yeah, it's still true that people join companies and leave managers. And so,
Right.
and the younger generation wants to feel emotionally connected to the manager. And if I don't feel valued, appreciated, and needed, then I'm going to leave. And so it's really important as a manager that you go above and beyond, go out of your way to make sure, in particular, remote workers, but obviously all workers feel valued, feel appreciated, and feel needed. And be really careful about having this weird imbalance between quote needing your in-person folks more than you quote need your remote folks, because there could be a tendency to do that, give responsibilities, but thus provide opportunities for the folks that you see on a regular basis that you're not actually providing to the remote folks.
Last question here. Are we ever gonna go to back are we ever gonna get back to all in person?
No, there is some companies are doing that right now, and they're insisting on it,
Mhm.
right? But there's it if you insist in all in person as an employer, better have a really good incentive structure to keep folks around, or if we have a very high unemployment rate, that could be another variable. But the technology is not going anywhere. It's just going to get more and more advanced, particularly now with what's happening in the AI world.
That's very true. Jeff, thanks for a good conversation about how to explore the changing, and I'm gonna say the word landscape, even though that's the word that ChatGPT uses to describe everything these days, and I try not to use it as much anymore. But we are in an ever-changing landscape of virtual teams. Thanks for your insights.
Yeah, thanks, Raj. Always a pleasure.